what needs to be decommissioned or early phased out, and how do we link that phase out of fossil fuels adequately with a phase-in pipeline of clean energy technologies? And where is the biggest emission reduction potential? And importantly, how do we monitor in real time whether these actions are collectively adding up to a credible transition? Because unless we connect the data, the finance, and the implementation, unless we explicitly link the phase-in of clean technologies with the phase-out of fossil fuels, we cannot design the right incentives, the public infrastructure that's needed, or financing instruments to make the transition truly work. And this is precisely the gap that the IDP was created to fill. We are building the platform, we are building the financial mechanisms and the partnerships to make it work. And that's why we're here also today, to connect the dots, to hear from our truly distinguished panel, both in person and online, that represent different parts of the equation. I'm pleased to have here with us today Johan Rockström, Director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, and I'm sure you've heard that introduction a lot since you're here at POP already, and Professor in Earth System Science at the University of Potsdam. Frank Alderson, member of the European Central Bank Executive Committee, who will walk us through how the ECB can support in climate finance and the role of financial regulation. We have here with us Sabine Mauderer, First Deputy Governor of the Deutsche Bundesbank and the Chair of the Network for Greening the Financial System. Welcome. We have online joining us Alyssa Kleininus. She will be running us through the International Decarbonization Partnership in more detail. We have Mahmoud Mohieddin, UN Special Envoy on financing the 2030 Sustainable Finance Agenda. We have with us Bruce Usher, professor at the Columbia Business School, an investment leader with a focus on large-scale infrastructure. And last but not least, Eric Bergloff, chief economist at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, who will talk us through the role of multilateral development banks and the challenge faced today. We have about a bit more than an hour. I appreciate the speaker list is very long, but with that, let's begin by grounding ourselves in the science, and I would love to hand it over to Professor Johan Rockström for his opening remarks. Thank you very much.
Yeah, good morning, everyone, and thanks, Moritz. And actually, I must say that I'm a bit disappointed because I think we are today at this hour going to have what potentially is the most important session to guide the transition away from danger at COP30 in Belém. And my disappointment is that we're so few at this session. Great that you've chosen this, but I think keep your attention here, because I think that what will be discussed here may be potentially the most effective science-based mechanism to accelerate the pathway away from coal, oil, and gas, meaning a key element for what we need as an outcome also of the entire COP30 here in Belém. And just to give the framing of why this is so essential, it will come as no surprise to you. I'm sure that you're well updated, but yesterday here, the remaining carbon budget was released from the scientific community. And the conclusion is, that we're basically run out of carbon. We have 130 billion tons of carbon dioxide remaining to have a 50% chance of coming back to 1.5 degrees Celsius after limited overshoot. But that 130 billion tons of carbon dioxide, which is equivalent to like 3-4 years of emissions at current rate, is actually not the real budget that we operate policy against, because that's the physical budget that the atmosphere or the Earth system can cope with without exceeding the 1.5 and entering into danger, which will likely lead to number of feedback mechanisms that will bump up warming even more. The best and most ambitious climate policies operate against a completely different budget, which is the budget that has already factored in very optimistic assumptions on carbon dioxide removal. So if you take the world's most ambitious climate policy regime, which is the European Union's Green Deal, the 90% reductions by 2040, which was agreed upon finally in the European Parliament just a few days back, that is based on a budget that assumes carbon dioxide removal scaling to up to 400 billion tons of carbon dioxide between now and the end of this century. It assumes that we'll be able to transition the food system from source to sink, assumes no tipping points, it assumes the ocean is stable, and it assumes we won't destroy the Amazon rainforest. All of this is in the assumptions for a climate policy that is the most ambitious in the world, which is still not adopted by more than a fraction of countries in the world. This is why when Morris says that we're in a situation of speed and scale away from danger, it is so well supported by science. So it won't be enough to have finance to scale the phasing in of renewable energy. What we need is also financial mechanisms to phase out fossil fuels. But we know that we cannot phase out fossil fuels in a way that ruins economies. So we have to find the incentives and the financial mechanisms to do this in a way that we can phase up renewable energy in an exponential way and phase out coal, oil, and gas also in an orderly way, but very fast, while keeping economies and societies and the purchasing power among citizens intact. And we have the solution. So let's see how it goes.
Thank you so much, Johan, for these opening remarks. And with this, I would like to hand the word to Frank Alderson, and I think we have a keynote speech prepared by him. Let's just see if these hybrid events truly work.
Good morning. It is an honor for me to speak to you today, albeit virtually. The urgency to act on the escalating climate and biodiversity crisis has never been greater. The United Nations Emissions Gap Report recently warned that we are on track for a global temperature rise of 2.3 to 2.5 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. And moreover, humanity is exceeding seven of the 9 planetary boundaries identified by Professor Johan Roekstrom. Equally alarming are tipping points that are at risk of being breached, such as the dieback of the Amazon rainforest and the collapse of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. To address the climate and nature crises, we need decisive action. First and foremost, policy action is essential, with governments in the driving seat. However, achieving a well-managed transition demands collective efforts from across the entire economy. Public and private actors must work together to scale up investment and make production processes and value chains more sustainable. Today, I will focus on how the ongoing climate and nature crises intersect with our core mandates as a central bank and a banking supervisor, maintaining price stability and safeguarding financial stability. And as we carry out our mandates, we cannot ignore the view outside our window. The unfolding climate and nature crises are already profoundly affecting the economy. And to ensure price stability and safeguard financial stability, we must factor in these challenges. Failing to do so would jeopardize our ability to deliver on our responsibilities. Climate change and nature degradation are significant drivers of economic disruption and have become increasingly integral to our daily work. Flooding, for instance, has grown more frequent and more severe. Over the last 30 years, floods have affected 5.5 million people and cost over 170 billion in damages. Recently, in August 2023, flooding in Slovenia wiped out 16% of the country's GDP in just a few days. And similarly, floods in Valencia, Spain, last year resulted in losses of 17 billion euros. And today, 10% of Europe's urban population lives in flood-prone areas. Heat waves provide a stark example of how climate change directly affects the economy. Studies reveal that extreme summer heat waves can immediately reduce regional economic activity by around 1%, with long-term outputs remaining 3% lower, even 4 years after the drought. The extreme weather events that struck Europe this summer resulted in losses estimated at 43 billion euros. The short-term scenarios of the Network for Green the Financial System show that in the next 5 years, extreme weather events could account for a drop in euro area economic output of up to 5%. And such a 5% shock would be comparable in scale to the global financial crisis. As central bankers, we are particularly concerned about how these phenomena contribute to inflationary pressures. Heat waves, for example, tend to drive up food prices. And ECB research estimates that the extreme heat of the summer of 2022 alone increased food prices in the euro area by 0.7 percentage points. And beyond the euro area, the impact of recent extreme weather events has also affected the global market price of vital commodities such as olive oil, cacao, and coffee. Addressing the climate and nature crises requires a dual approach of mitigation and adaptation. And the tools to mitigate climate change exist, and progress has been made since the Paris Agreement, with banks increasingly factoring climate performance into their lending decisions. However, scaling solutions and mobilizing investment remain challenging. Significant investment gaps persist, particularly in renewable energy, with the European Commission estimating that an annual investment of nearly 150 billion euros is needed until 2030 for generation capacity and modernizing grids. The analysis consistently shows that the benefits of a timely transition far outweigh the costs. Completing the banking and capital markets union is therefore essential for Europe, as it could enable efficient financing of sustainable energy, which in turn can lower costs, enhance resilience, and reduce reliance on imported fossil fuels. Alongside mitigation, adaptation is vital. Resilient infrastructure can reduce the impact of extreme weather. And additionally, conducting climate stress tests enables the evaluation of what-if scenarios, fostering economic stability and enhancing preparedness. So where do we stand today, we as an ECB, with integrating climate and nature considerations into price and financial stability? In our 21 Monetary Policy Strategy Review, we recognize the significant impact of climate change on monetary policy. And therefore we incorporated climate considerations into our monetary policy tools. And since February 23, corporate bond purchases have prioritized issuers with stronger climate performance. And as of the second half of 26, our collateral framework will account for climate-related risks to bolster financial resilience. And this year we widened our focus to include nature degradation into our strategy, reflecting the link between the climate crisis, nature health, and price stability. With regards to banking supervision, our mandate is clear: ensuring banks manage material risks effectively, including those stemming from the climate and nature crises. And since 2019, we have taken steps to ensure banks assess and address these risks, underscoring our commitment to financial system stability. And we are not alone in that effort. Together with 148 other central banks and supervisors within the Central Banks and Supervisors Network for Green the Financial System, We have recently issued a statement reaffirming our commitment to supporting a timely transition. Let me conclude. The challenges of climate crisis and the nature degradation are immediate, and they are already reshaping our economies. And this is creating material financial risks. Ignoring or hiding the challenges will not lessen their impact on monetary policy and on banking supervision. And this is why we are staying the course with addressing climate and nature risks in all the aspects of our work. I thank you very much, and I wish you a very good day.
Thank you so much for these remarks, and it's wonderful to see the work and action of the climate of the European Central Bank. We have Frank Alderson here live with us, so I would ask a follow-up question. And as discussed so far, it is clear that large-scale investments in emission reduction at scale are needed to decrease climate risk and economic losses. If the EU Commission and member governments were to approve such funds, would it be enough? And from your perspective, what else do we need to mobilize the necessary investment, especially from private capital?
Well, thank you very much, Morris, for having me here live, and I'm glad that the connection works. A great event, wonderful colleagues here on the panel. So the climate and nature crises are already profoundly impacting the economy. And we need to take this into account when setting our monetary policy and when we supervise our banks. So from our perspective, an orderly transition is essential to ensure both these two stabilities that we are responsible for, price stability on the one hand and financial stability on the other. The financial demands of addressing climate and nature crisis are immense. All of you know that. There are many numbers out there, but just achieving, to give you one example, Europe's climate and energy targets already requires 330 billion euros in annual investments by 2030. So although the financing needs are vast, our economy-wide stress test shows that the economic benefits of a timely transition far outweigh the costs, really far outweigh, especially when considered against the alternative scenarios of doing nothing or doing too little too late. Now, clearly, governments and development banks are best placed to provide public funding for these efforts. However, the scale of the funding, and I think you referred to that earlier, the scale of funding that is required is actually far beyond what governments alone can provide. So to close this investment gap, we must create an environment that is conducive to private funding. And this can be achieved through, if you like, two key avenues. First and foremost, by unleashing private investment through more integrated capital markets. And for Europe, this means a key priority, which will be completing the Savings and Investment Union to accelerate private investments. As more integrated financial markets have the potential to offer a wider range of financial instruments that can actually help close that investment gap. And more integrated financial markets could also facilitate the growth of sustainable debt instruments like green bonds or sustainable bonds. And also the alignment of climate and nature-related disclosure frameworks plays a crucial role as a key enabling factor, if you like, in this story. Now, second, governments can step forward and help de-risking investments and provide convenient business conditions. So fiscal support measures such as tax credits and guarantees can play a role by mitigating the financing costs of firms and by de-risking green investments. Structural reforms are also needed to set the right market-based incentives to accelerate the green transition and to avoid investment shortfalls. And let me stop here because there's many others that want to contribute to this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frank. And I think we've heard the term quite a bit already, cost of inaction. And I think in particular, the NGFS has published a lot of interesting papers and research articles around this. So I would love to hand the word to Sabine Mauderer.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you. And I think what you heard from Johan and also from Frank was, I think, quite, telling that cost of inaction are pretty high. But maybe since Moritz, you mentioned the NGFS, for most of you, most probably have not heard what is this animal about. So as Frank, I'm also in the central bank community. And besides being the first deputy governor of the German central bank, I'm also the chair of this so-called Network for Greening the Financial System. And this is an organization of more than, about 150 central banks and banking supervisory agencies that have come together to better understand the financial risks that climate and also nature bear. So, and I just want to pick up what Johan said. Well, it's sometimes surprising, or more said that, it seems that we all know the figures and what is going to happen. And still, this room is not packed. And I mean, climate is not so prominent on the agenda than it was a couple of years before. So the question is, why is this, right? And maybe I start with the good news. So I think we have a diverse world. So in the beginning of January, one of our, a very important member of this network I just mentioned, it was the Federal Reserve Bank of the US, gave me a call and say, well, unfortunately, they want or they will exit our organization. And we don't have to discuss why. I think you all know this. And of course, as you can imagine, my concern was at that time, or maybe this is the end of our organization, or many will exit it as well. But this was definitely not the case. And I can tell you, this is the good news, is it was rather the opposite. So we even this year got new central banks who said, oh, hello, this is a great organization, and I need to do or understand much more about the climate risk and climate finance. So can I also become a member? So over the last month, we had I think 5 to 6 new members. So, and this tells you, and global. So the interest is still very high. But so why, as I said, it's a diverse world. So on the one hand, we see scientists, technocrats like central banks with an increasing interest and much more work. And on the other hand, we see, a decreasing interest from the population and also from the corporate world. And I think what we, and also in this bubble here today, is really have to understand is we are in our own bubble. For us, figures, numbers, curves we'd like to discuss is pretty clear and it's obvious. But we are just a bubble and we are a really small community. So I think our task is to translate our knowledge we do have, which will develop over the next years, as to translate it to everyone who needs to know. And I think this is something what we try to do also in our international organization with the so-called scenarios. So what we do a lot of things, but one of our flagship products are the so-called climate scenarios. So we have long-term scenarios, basically having a look at, okay, what could be the world by 2050 in political terms? Would we see no climate in action at all? So we end up in a hot world or hot house world scenario, or would we just see, okay, we are now experiencing fatigue, but maybe in 5 years' time, there's a new generation, all of a sudden, suddenly the politicians awake, and then we would have a significant delay on transition, but we still would have a transition. So as you can imagine, there are different scenarios you can think of, and each scenario has an assumptions to have a different impact on the economic outcome. So what does that mean in terms of economic growth for regions, for the globe? What does that mean in terms of inflation, of productivity, of employment rates, and so on? So these scenarios we do. what we, and this is what Johan said, is why then, you know, central bank were interested, maybe also banking supervision agencies, but why doesn't it raise more interest from, you know, the general or corporate side? And the reason is because 2050 is too far away. What we need to do is to give a little bit more on a short-term and medium-sized perspective. So that was the reason why we just in May this year published a rather short to medium-term scenarios that have a time horizon to 2030. And this is a time horizon where even CEOs and CFOs, but also politically elected parties or politicians really think, okay, this is within my term I'm responsible for. So I rather have a look at this. And I think this is the key point of, you know, how can we mobilize more people also in finance or those who are responsible. So maybe one thing I want to highlight about, you know, the basic understanding of where does the money come from and why isn't there more money mobilized. I think the world is still thinking that it is about public money, and also the negotiations here by nature are basically about what can sovereigns, what do governments contribute to this. But to be honest, I think we all know this is just a fraction of the money we need. The vast majority needs to come from the private sector. And just to give you a little bit of some numbers to tell how little in the future also from the public side might come is we live in a time of a really high debt level of the sovereigns, of the government. You know, we have just the IMF just published new figures, and it tells you that the average, global average debt to GDP, so growth to debt ratio, is now on average 100%. And just, you know, 15 years ago, it was 70%, which historically is already pretty high. So if you see that not just emerging markets or developing countries are suffering from high debt levels, now also the advanced economies where usually the money transfer comes from are really suffering from extremely high debt levels. So what does that tell you? That, you know, mobilizing climate finance is becoming more and more challenges in a time where we definitely, as Johan and Frank also pointed out, need even more. And you know, if we continue to talk about that, I could, you know, as you imagine, I'm very passionate about this topic, but I stop here in the interest of time.
Thank you so much, Sabine. And I'm sure we will have some time at the end for an open Q&A. But just one follow-up question. So you talked about the short-term scenarios and obviously the NGFS role in the central banking community. For actors outside of the central banking world, is there also, do you see value in the toolkits and extensive knowledge that you have acquired through the community? I'm thinking about actors in countries that are actively supporting transitions, multilateral development banks, but also finance ministries that could really benefit from these scenarios and the technical capabilities?
Yeah, sure. So we know already that pension funds, that even big American indices are using our scenarios, right? And also some corporates have a look at it, some use that, or even part of it using that. When it comes to the short-term scenarios, this is something where, you know, we started this in May, and we started with extreme weather events. So these are in comparison to the long-term scenarios, our short-term scenarios are rather extreme scenarios. This might happen, but not necessarily will happen. So in order to being used by a broader community out of the central bank work, what our next step would be is to have rather centered short-term or medium-term scenarios in order to allow also other stakeholders to use them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And with that, I would like to hand the word to Alyssa Kleininus. She has, with her work and research, together with colleagues at Imperial and Columbia University, really been at the forefront of the underlying research that supports the IDP. Alyssa, over to you.
So good morning, everyone. Thank you so much to Frank Elderson, Sabine Mauder, and Professor Johan Rockström for the fantastic remarks that preceded mine. Let me say that I say here to all of those, particularly the remarks by Johan Rockström, that it is absolutely essential to link phase in to phase out, and that there's no realistic hope of staying close to 1.5 degrees unless we implement this rapidly, and that we have a solution and we should get to it. And I also would like to echo the words of Sabine Maurer, who said, 2050 is too far for many actors to take current action seriously. And in a way, I would say, but Johan Rockström can, I'm sure, comment on that better, that the fact that we essentially have no carbon budget left, barring for also negative emissions, means by necessity, if we want to stay close to 1.5 degrees, that all the action has to happen in this very decade, and that's on the plate of current policy makers and current investors. So with that, let me start my presentation. We are here today because we all know the truth. The central challenge is no longer about pledges. It is about credible implementation at scale. And a decisive priority for our global stability is closing the climate finance gap for emerging and developing economies. For years, progress has been stalled. And today I am here to present a new concrete proposal, as per Johan Rockström's remark, let's get to the solution, on how we can work together to break that impasse. And we propose an international decarbonization partnership. It would be a public-private partnership on the need, per Sabine's point, to engage private finance at the right scale, designed to do one thing and to do it at scale, to finance as a starting point whole of country power sector transitions. Let's be candid, our current solutions are not working. This chart shows the hard truth. Over the last 10 years, we have invested nearly $8 trillion in clean power in emerging and developing economies, and yet emissions have still increased. Why? We believe it is for two primary structural reasons. First, there is no link to fossil phase-out. We have been financing individual project-based clean energy, which is good, but it has been completely unlinked to the phasing out of fossil fuels. No coherent country-level transition plans exist to coordinate these transitions. The result? We are building new clean power, but old fossil fuel power plants continue to run, and new fossil power plants are being built. The result is that emissions continue to rise year after year. Second, our financial structuring is inefficient. The cost of capital for clean energy and EMDEs is usually 2 to 3 times higher in high-income countries than in high-income countries. And our public investment, mostly in the form of senior debt, although concessional or small grants, has failed to mobilize private capital. The current leverage ratio is a failure. For every public dollar invested, we are only mobilizing 38 cents of private money. These factors mean that we are underinvesting in clean energy while doing virtually nothing to ensure the fossil fuel phase out that is absolutely critical, because let's be candid, the climate crisis is a fossil fuel crisis, primarily. But we can solve this, and we can do it by linking grants with a smarter form of blended finance. This is the very core of the proposed International Decarbonization Partnership, IDP. We propose creating, under the IDP, individual country transition funds, at least one fund for each EMDE partner nation that is willing to commit to decarbonization, including one focused on the power sector, the lowest hanging fruit, with 15 gigatons out of 37 gigatons of global CO2 emission reduction potential. Each fund would be financed by a coalition of high-income countries, and that does not need to include the US, right? And private investors. And it does for the power sector two things simultaneously. First, on the left, public grants would be used to pay for the politically hardest part, the phasing out, retiring fossil fuel plants early and funding a just workforce transition. And my research shows that that has an enormous economic return. It's not charity, and it is a lot more safe and foolproof than carbon credits. Second, on the right, blended finance for phase-in. We propose a public investment of approximately 25%, it depends obviously on the de-risking necessity in each country, EMD country, in the form of first loss junior equity. This lowers risk, in turn reducing the cost of capital, and it is thereby designed to crowd in the around 75% of capital from the private sector, precisely as per Sabine's point, because the public sector alone cannot pay for it. But let me make it clear here that having that necessary grant and equity investment by the public sector is necessary to unlock that private finance. This is the capital that builds the new renewables, the storage, and the investable grid extensions. And here is the key that ties it all together. The two pipelines are linked. All financing is tied to verified milestones and emission reductions, which make sure that rich countries are not fearing that their money would be squandered if they pay at the right scale, because any disbursement except the initial batch would be based on actual success in implementing this. The clean power investment and the fossil fuel retirement go hand in hand, ensuring that this time our investments actually reduce emissions and do so at the necessary gigaton scale to take the climate science of Professor Rockström and his colleagues seriously. Finally, it is important to understand that the model of the proposed international decarbonization partnership is designed to ensure energy security in EMDs. Again, per Johan Rockström's point that we need to keep these economies open by building new clean systems faster than old ones are being retired. This is a pro-growth model designed to increase net energy output and help power economic development while we decarbonize. And explicitly, this enables decarbonization while avoiding the trade-off that many of EMDs face that they otherwise have with economic growth. So that trade-off is not there. The proposed plan is not to accomplish this by asking lower income countries to take on more debt, even if concessional, or to ask high-income countries to simply provide conditional grants. The proposed plan is that this is investment, it is not climate aid. A growing body of academic research, including by my own, shows that even if we are pragmatic about which countries are likely to contribute, the cost, meaning the public cost, is actually surprisingly affordable, which matters as per Sabine's point that many countries are already having high debt levels. As power generation technologies are now readily available at scale, we modeled what it would cost if only climate-conscious, high-income countries participated and countries such as the US might not, financing the decarbonization in all emerging economies, excluding China and petrostates that can finance themselves. That cost we show in our work would be less than 0.3% of their GDP annually and less than 0.2% if China were to participate in HIC financing coalition, and just places against how much countries are now willing to increase their defense spending. It's not like rich countries cannot afford this, they totally can. It's a matter of whether they will. This is how much it would cost to avoid a climate catastrophe, the thing that Johan Rockström has been talking about in all his work. Again, this is largely investment, not grants or new debt. It is designed to be profitable for both the public and private sectors, for both developing and developed countries. Everyone involved will see strong returns. Our forecasts of our research show that an average internal rate of return of around 8% for public sector junior equity can be achieved, and this is before accounting for the economic gains of avoided climate damages. But when you do include the value of those avoided emissions, we show that the total social and economic return on this public capital is massive, between 9 to 504%. This makes the proposed international decarbonization partnership between developed and developing countries quite simply the highest return public investment of the 21st century. Building on this foundation, we have begun forming partnerships with high and developing countries and implementing partners to establish the International Decarbonization Partnership. The IDP takes the carbon budget as an explicit constraint. In other words, we take the climate science of Johan Rockström and colleagues completely seriously, and we ask not just, let's have more hope, but what does it actually take to implement in accordance with the carbon budget? So we deductively act so that it deductively acts commensurate with the right scale and speed to avoid the approaching climate catastrophe. The IDP can serve as a central coordinating body or a vehicle to build a consensus so that other implementing organizations can take over at the right time. To show that this is doable, we have built a digital energy transition coordination platform capable of helping EMDE governments to plan their own transitions and for financiers to assess their investments and monitor progress through verified emission tracking. In other words, enabling a one-on-one correspondence between a credible implementation plan aligned with the climate science and a credible financing plan that actually enables these countries to implement the transition at the right scale without coming at the cost of their development. Dear guests, decarbonizing EMDE power sectors is the single largest and most cost-effective source of emission reduction available to us, period. Of course, other sectors need to be decarbonized too, but this is the lowest hanging fruit. There is no other way to avoid a climate catastrophe. Without this, we have no chance, only false hope of staying close to 1.5 degrees. But this story is not a story of sacrifice. What we are proposing is a mutually beneficial plan for developed and developing worlds. In other words, for all of us on this planet. This is a plan that finances a transition capable of powering fast-paced development in emerging economies. It enables economic growth, it delivers financial returns to international investors, and it creates widespread economic gains for all of us in this world from reduced climate and health damages. We are here at COP30 because we are quite frankly out of time for small incremental solutions. As Professor Johan Rockström says, the only currency that counts in his early work is, speed and scale. And the existing models, including the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, as I'm happy to elaborate on in private conversation, were a good start, but they failed to accomplish either. We need to start coordinating our efforts rather than operating in silos. And we need to directly link the phasing out of clean energy to the phasing in of clean energy to the phasing out of fossil fuels. And we need to use properly structured financial instruments to actually mobilize enough private capital. And we need to do this now because we are out of time. With your help, we can build the International Decarbonization Partnership Coalition to make this a reality. We invite you to join us. Please scan on the screen to learn more, and please get in touch or find Maurice after the session. He can answer your questions. Thank you. Let's have realistic hope and do what it takes now to implement what is necessary to take the best available climate science seriously. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alyssa, for this run through of the IDP. A follow-up question to you perhaps is, we've seen that several major mitigation efforts, including JETPs, but also climate funds, but most haven't delivered full country transitions. So in your own words, what's different about the IDP model?
Thank you so much for this question. So for those of you who are familiar or not familiar, let me briefly explain. So there have been in prototype a few examples of deals between a coalition of high-income countries and a few countries that have committed to decarbonizing, including Indonesia, South Africa, and Vietnam, and a few others. But the problem with these JETP, so in principle, these were good ideas, right? So there was high-income country coalition of the willing, providing the public capital to crowd in private capital to help these countries accelerate their power sector transition. But there were at least a few problems, and I can later, of course, elaborate more in private conversation. One of them is that the countries did not actually offer climate finance at the right scale. So they offered for, let's say, Indonesia 20 billion, whereas the country itself estimates it needs 100 billion. So essentially, the country does not get the right finance to actually implement what it takes to be consistent with 1.5 degrees. Secondly, the finance that had been provided was not tied to a specific implementation plan, and also it was not tied or made conditional on successful demonstrated emission reduction. So we've talked a lot to EU and other policymakers, and they essentially kind of admit that the reason that they don't dare to pay at the right scale is that they worry that they would squander their money. So as one of our colleagues, Jeremy Zettermeier, says, rich countries are pretending to pay and poor countries are pretending to act, but neither is really doing something. So what we're saying is, in principle, you need to create these funds at the right scale to enact the transition consistent with the carbon budget. But except for the initial disbursement that gets the country started, each next batch of funding that would be released would be made conditional on that country successfully implementing emission reductions through that phase in and phase out of the pipeline. A second problem has been that the type of financing provided was largely concessional loans, which are often crowding out rather than crowding in private capital. And there was hardly any grant financing provided except for 2%, let's say in Indonesia, for technical assistance grants. So in Indonesia, the result is that they are still struggling because they didn't get money to actually pay for phase outs to close their first coal-fired power plant, and they're trying to do it through carbon credits, but that's not easy to raise money in the right amount. And in the meantime, the grid is oversupplied, so they cannot actually add renewables unless they close coal first, but they haven't paid for that. So they're stuck in a bottleneck type of barrier. So what you need, and rich countries think that if they pay grants, that they give away money, and they like to pay loans because then they somehow think they get their money back. Whereas what we show in our research is that actually if they pay grants and catalytic capital, that is, let's say, a junior equity stake, it's not give away money. It has an enormous social economic return that is absolutely in their own economic interest. And the final thing I would say is that the finance that has been provided often in a very uncoordinated way. So let's take South Africa as an example. Here, the European Investment Bank has been the one that was providing the loan of the EU. Again, concessional loan, not catalytic capital, not grants. And they provided this loan for a whole host of things, including electric vehicle charging stations and so on and so forth. But they didn't actually tie that finance to a credible and cohesive phase out and phase in plan. And there was no grant funding provided to close coal properly. So as a result, South Africa is now saying, if we are to close this coal plant, we have no plan in place to make sure that we have energy security because it's not tight, right? Phase out and phase in are not tight. And they haven't actually gotten money to close that plant first, so they're not really willing to. So all of this is to say that if you do not, oftentimes people think, we do like a half effort, right? We kind of provide money, but not at the right scale. We kind of provide money, but not in the right type. But when you do a half effort, you run into bottlenecks. And so what we are saying is this is totally doable. We know how to do it. we take a country's current energy mix, we take the NGFS scenarios of how emissions need to be reduced to be consistent with the carbon budget, we take NGFS scenarios of projected energy demand, country can update it if they have something better. We can form a phase-out pipeline of which fossil fuel assets to close when. We can form a phase-in pipeline of which renewable assets to introduce when and where to make sure we don't have an energy shortage and we keep up with growing energy demand. And we actually link finance one-on-one with the implementation plan. And that's obviously absolutely necessary because you cannot close a plant of coal unless you know what to build in its place. Otherwise, you have an energy security issue. You cannot build renewables unless you can connect it to the grid. You cannot do all of this unless you have actually the right finance. So this is all to say that we can do it. Let's have hope, but we need to focus not on more talk, but on implementation. And for that reason, we invite everyone that is listening to this to join us in this partnership that we are seeking to establish. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. And I think energy security is a good keyword, but I would love to hand it over now to Mahmoud Mohildin to speak from the emerging market perspective.
Right. Thank you so much. Well, I only wish to be with you in Belém, but I had to leave to attend the B20 and the G20 in South Africa. So let me congratulate you for convening this event. And to start by the good wisdom and knowledge of a top scientist or the top scientist in this area, Johan, whom I'm admiring forever his work and his brave approach in tackling tough topics against some of the currents that we see around us. And it's very much refreshing to see as well the voices of top central bankers. From what we heard from Sabine and Frank about why they should be concerned for reasons related to their very core line of business. Of course, as educated, concerned members of the community, they should be concerned like the rest of us. But even if they just mind their own business as central bankers, concerned about monetary stability, controlling or putting inflation under control, if they want to make sure that there is financial stability and the deposits and their way of allocations are in safe hands, and the investments are not going into areas that are being compromised because of exposure of climate risk. And we see some malpractices where many banks are still not adding the adequate provisions that they should really be doing when they are committed in finance for highly exposed, uninsurable assets. I think I commend the good words coming from them both. And it's good that they are not alone. They emphasize in different ways. They are part of networks. And then the other side, if the Brazilian presidency is to be celebrated for many things, I think it could be for this circle of finance ministers. So if we have the commanding heights with us between the central bankers and the ministers of finance aligned that they need to do something together, what's missing here? Why Johan is disappointed, not just because of the participation level that he's not happy with, but because of lack of action, because we're exhausting the whatever remaining of the carbon budget as emphasized by him and as by illustrated by Alyssa. And if I'm taking it from the developing economies and emerging markets perspective, I have to share the following. And some of what I'm going to say may not necessarily be met with happy reactions if you are taking it from a very narrow perspective of what's so-called the global north, if you believe on what's so-called global south. But we are in this world together. We are only good in dividing us for sometimes for simplicity and sometimes for complicating matters further. That always remind me of what my late father said to me once, frustrated by me, why you make it difficult if you can make it impossible. So it's already difficult, and we are making it impossible by all of these divisions. But if I'm sitting in one of these countries, emerging markets and developing economies, and you have heard like me again and again and again, leaders, including from my continent, Africa, saying, and perhaps Johan can confirm that again, that the contribution of us in the harm of the planet is a fraction of the big harm. It's 3%, it's 4%. So the focus, as mentioned earlier by Sabine as well, that, well, we know who is the emitter, we know who is the polluter, we know who is causing the damage. So I would say the natural start should be by those who have the more than 70 or perhaps 80% of the emissions responsibility of the advanced and some of the emerging markets members of the G20, which are going to meet at a summit level in a few days. So that could be worthy of focus. But then when I see it from the developing economies and emerging markets, nothing to be celebrated actually by being at this very low level, because it's a confirmation that at the prevailing technology, these countries are not producing enough and they are not consuming enough. I would have celebrated if these countries have their fair share, but they are doing that with the clean type of energy that Alisa and others mentioned, a clean energy to support this kind of growth and development. But at the prevailing technologies, including using fossil fuel, including with the fact that the 700 million are without access to electricity, and the World Bank and the African Development Bank now are joining forces in the case of Africa for their 300 million household connectivity through electricity. So here there is a great deal of discrepancy to start with. So if I want to focus, I would focus on the emitters, and I would really do better with those countries that are trying to grow and develop without really getting them into the wrong approach, the grow today and clean up tomorrow, which we have been suffering from forever, which is basically the approach that had been adopted since the first industrial revolution. So how can we deal with the whole matter then? First, stopping the harm. And one of the harms, it may not really be sound as related, but Sabine reminded us that budget constraints are there and debt is there, not just in the case of the developing economies, as she mentioned, but the advanced economies. But let me just emphasize, the 100% plus of average debt to GDP, when you translate it into a case of a typical developing economies and emerging markets, because of the cost of capital and cost of borrowing, the debt service is really huge. So I would really encourage as well, use the debt service ratio along with the ratio that she quoted from the IMF. And here we have the puzzling question when it comes to many African countries putting their fiscal policy under the usual constraints, especially if they are under an IMF program. A Minister of Finance could celebrate having a positive surplus of budget, but at the same time, they have huge and growing debt service to worry about. So we need to deal with this issue by encouraging, as mentioned by Alisa, that when we are designing these projects, they don't need to be debt dependent. More than 80% of climate finance to developing economies and emerging markets happen to be today debt dependent. And the majority of this debt is not concessional anymore, it's commercial. I appreciate that some of these projects may have commercial returns, but not in adaptation. Although that I fancy this fantastic work that for every dollar that we put, including in adaptation, could generate 4 up to 10 times of return. Well, as you know, a very active private equity firm would be only happy with like 10 plus or 15 plus with risk-adjusted return. But if you are telling me it's more than 4 times, more than 10 times, how can we capture the value and to translate it into incentive? This will be a good thing to consider. So we need to be less debt dependent. And the other thing, quoting Esther Duflo, the Nobel Prize laureate, there is a moral debt, which again emphasized my point related to the emitters, that many of the advanced economies just shifted their production line elsewhere, and they are consuming without any kind of change of behavior. So it's just the machine moved from Europe and the US in some cases to some developing economies and emerging markets. And the moral debt as calculated here could be equivalent to the external debt of the developing economies and emerging markets. But the problem here that you cannot really just cancel this with the other. It's more complicated than that, but she put it just as a point of emphasis. The other thing that gets me very concerned is the spillover of many good policies, at least at face value, like many of the green initiatives and many of the new industrial policies, but some of them are not adequately designed and without really this kind of multilateral kind of discussion that is warranted if you have a policy that will have spillover across your border. A few days, not even few weeks now, few days from now, exporters to Europe will be subject to the cross-border adjustment mechanism, the CBAM. At face value, it's fantastic. Europe is taking action. Europe is trying to level the playing field from the disciplined producer against not very disciplined exporters to them. And then we put a CBAM. I would have really liked this CBAM to be negotiated through the very forum that you are sitting at today in Belém, through the UNFCCC, bring the WTO, the multilateral body for the rules of trade. I'm always happy to see that kind of rule-based approach to be applied. If it is kosher and WTO compatible, let's do it. But if it is not, we need really to go back to something, because I was in the room when I was coordinating one of the sessions in COP27 as a climate champion, I was called then, and the head of the EU was there with the African Union and the South African President Ramaphosa on the just energy transition. If the CBAM matches what Alisa mentioned now of the proper, gradual, orderly transition, and I think the orderly transition was mentioned by Frank in a different way. Just is orderly, orderly is just. If you are going to have abrupt kind of policies and then you can really have, let's exempt this, let's accept that, it's a very flawed model and it will have very serious implications. An IMF study on the implications of the CBAM on the exporting countries is not that significant on their GDP because they are not exporting that much as a ratio of GDP. But for the exporting sectors, it's an equivalent of an average of 15 to 20% of many of the African countries. This is not really part of the just energy transition. This may have some sort of negative spillovers that were not intended by this policy. So I would say for the policy that we need to put, phase it in right, phase it out right, and get concerned with the social implications. And this is one of the reasons of failure of some of the projects mentioned by Alisa, because full of good intentions, mobilized money, but we say, well, where is the money then of concessional nature? Before you ask me to turn off, I don't know what is the source of this electricity in my room here, but before you tell me turn it off, because I'm not quite sure if it is green or not, you need really to provide this room with the electricity from the green. This is it, phase in, phase out. And actually before, the order was wrong because the phasing out in the case of South Africa, where they have what can cover them of energy from electricity from coal for more than 180 years, 180 years. Who is paying the cost of the stranded assets here? You can say, well, bad luck. Well, I think technology will make many of these kind of old sources of energy redundant. And as being reminded forever by the Secretary General of the UN, who is a strong voice in this, that the Stone Age didn't change because of lack of stone, but because of new technologies that got us to abandon using stone in our life. I know that I went beyond the limits of my time, but let me just say a couple of more things and wrap it up. In the project design, I'm happy to see many of the green smart projects being implemented, but I'm happy that Johan at the beginning, in his very subtle way, told us in few seconds how theory of change could be applied. It is science through technology, it is finance for implementation, and it's incentives for behavioral change. And I'm very much concerned, and actually Alisa mentioned that in different ways, while the central bankers emphasize the finance side, as they should. But actually, we have really a problem almost in every front. Finance is insufficient, inefficient, and unfair, and very much all of the arguments about the 300 billion to mobilize 1.3 trillion. Good luck with that. But we need to see first the 300 million to be leveraged, and we could be much better than the 35 or the 34% of the dollar that Alisa mentioned. And then when it comes to technology, yes, technology was there and it was responsible for the reduction of the cost of electricity produced. And each time we quote a figure, we get corrected. But technology didn't travel without finance, without institutions, and without policy. And all of that didn't happen without incentives. And actually, if you quote some of the top car producers today in the US, they are telling you that the sales of EV cars is going to be dropping in a very vertical way next year because of the lack of support to this industry. Having said that, I'm still very much optimistic because the younger generation are very much aware and more sophisticated than the older ones, and they care for their future. And the technology is very much for us and not against us on this. And the finance, we are not in short of it, and we can mobilize it with better knowledge and better education and better sharing of updates, including, given that some of the top representatives of the MDBs will be speak after me, there is this fantastic piece called the GEMS, which is the database for emerging markets cost, that is telling us that the cost of default is not really as it's being perceived, and the defaults in emerging markets and developing economies is much less than being perceived, and that has been updated, including twice now in the Hamburg Climate Week. But is that reflected in the market? No, it's not. We just get data, and we do not really translate this data into action. Let me finalize my talk here by saying, well, this issue of pretending, the advanced pretend to do something, and it's in a big game of pretending. It seems that some people who are really at the driving seat in many countries and in many companies have mastered the art of doing nothing by just trying to say what the audience would like to hear, even sign MOUs from time to time, do some pledges, but when it comes to translation, we're not really seeing the kind of incentives to do that. I'm very happy with the proposal that Alisa articulated. We're happy to get it more tailored for the needs of individual cases of developing emerging markets. We're not the same. Even we talk about Africa, it's 54 countries with their own idiosyncrasies, but I think it has more to be applied than what we can just say we're not just happy with everything. We cannot really make the perfect enemy of the good. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mahmoud. Thank you so much for reminding us about the realities of climate finance and the transitions. Because we are running out of time, I would pause the questions for now and hope that we might have some more time after the session. But I would love to hand it over to Bruce. We do only have about 5 minutes left, Bruce. So maybe you can do some quick remarks so we can hear still from Eric here in the room. I do really apologize for running over. Thank you. Over to you, Bruce.
Yes, no problem. I'll be very brief, and make sure Eric has some time. And look, let me make a couple points to add to what Dr. Maheldin and Jonah Roxham have said, which is the timing is very important here, and not for the climate reason, not for the reason because we are running out of time on climate. Everybody knows that, that's obvious. But the timing is right because look, I've been working in the sector for 25 years, investing in climate solutions. And 25 years ago, there was nothing to invest in. There was no affordable renewable. There were no EVs. Even 5 years ago, these products, in most cases, are more expensive than the incumbent products. So how do you finance something that's not competitive? It's not really that feasible. Today, as I think you all know, the situation is very different. Renewable energy in most places is the cheapest form of power. EVs are becoming cost competitive in most markets. We're seeing rapid growth. Yes, when subsidies are removed, growth slows, but it doesn't seem to actually stop these industries at this point, right? So the timing of bringing capital to these markets is key. So why isn't the capital flowing at the scale we need? And the answer, of course, is related to risk. And reducing some of those risks, particularly, and I haven't heard this mentioned yet, around foreign exchange. Foreign exchange risk remains a very key risk, a valid risk. I do think the design of this partnership to, put 25% first loss capital might be able to reduce the foreign exchange risk enough for private capital to flow in most developing countries. So that could take care of the risk part of it. But the other part of the equation is not just risk, and people don't talk too much about the challenges of putting financial capital to work. Private sector capital can only move at scale, right? You look at the size of the funds that have been raised by the large infrastructure funds today. They're very large, in the tens of billions, and to put capital to work in many countries, it has to be at scale. And so that creates a catch-22. If the projects are not yet at scale, or if there's lack of familiarity with opportunities in those countries, you don't get the scale, and that's catch-22, prevents them from putting capital to work. So again, this facility, as I understand it, sort of bundling projects together to smooth the path, to create a pipeline, to overcome that scale challenge, I think has tremendous merit as well. So the risk part, specifically foreign exchange risk, this is the biggest risk that private capital faces today. And the scale challenge, this is the biggest challenge, I think. There are others too, but these are the two big ones. A partnership like this, if it can tackle those two challenges, I believe the capital will flow, because the projects are now attractive. These renewable projects, the EV charging, EV sales, and the like, it's there to be financed. So let me just stop there. Very brief comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bruce, and thank you for these comments. I would now like to hand it over to Eric. You have the honor of closing us off because we're running a bit over time. Given what you've heard today in these conversations and from the other speakers, what are your remarks and the perspective from multilateral development banks? Over to you.
Thank you. So, I come from a development bank, the newest member of the MDB family. Climate is our #1 corporate objective. We have been committed to being more than 50% climate finance. Last year, we did 67%. We also now do policy-based lending for climate, and we think that this kind of proposal could be very, very helpful in integrating into policy. So 2 weeks ago, we approved a loan here to Brazil for $1 billion for climate policy with a very strong nature, strong health component. So when I look at this proposal, it doesn't, at least I was using the JET-Ps, but I think the reference point is really the country platform that Mahmoud's country, Egypt, has had. That has a very clear platform for private sector and the public sector involvement in the renewables. It's putting these projects on a platform. It has concessional finance for decommissioning of the coal sector. It has sustainability linked financing from Germany for commitments to the NDCs. So what does this proposal add? Well, I think, first of all, adds a lot more data. It's more science-based. It creates transparency. It increases ownership in the sense that the government has more capacity to control the process. It adds more attractiveness for the private sector to come in to these structures. It focuses more on equity. So you bring in, instead of having all this debt finance, it brings in equity. It allows also, I think, by integrating with policy frameworks, it allows you to have a much more optimal balance between energy security, the demand projections, getting grid stability, which is a huge issue for many emerging and developing economies, and it allows you to have a much better visibility on how this is affecting different groups and different parts of a country. So the just transition, it brings a lot. So very encouraged by this proposal. I think it still has some elements that one would like to see, I would like to see some more elements. I think the currency issue is a big one. We would like to see much more of this funding going into local currency. Again, equity is local currency, so that's good. But we also, on the debt side, we need more local currency. And this kind of pools that are being created around individual countries lend themselves very well to local currency financing. So I think that could be a very important element. Let me end with the big elephant in the room is, of course, the availability of concessional finance. And how do we get this? We know that concessional finance is less and less available at the moment, and there are competing demands, particularly around security. So we really need to emphasize the elements here that are not relying so much on concessional finance. Those elements, and Alyssa put this very well, I think. It is an investment opportunity. This is not really ultimately about providing concessional finance. So we look forward very much to working with Alyssa and her team to try to help us when we engage on climate policy in individual countries. And I have a list of countries that I would love to engage with Alyssa and her team on. So very much looking forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric, for these remarks. And I would maybe like to close us off. If it's fine, spontaneously, I would like to give the speakers in the room 30 minutes, 30 seconds each for some final remarks or last sentences. And then I'm sure we stick around for a bit for some questions. If Johan, if you would like.
Yeah, thanks. No, I hope that you agree with me that this provides the basis for something that really needs to enter deep into the negotiations and the discussions here in Belém. And I think what Eric just and Sabine as well have been emphasizing that the public sector will not be able to do this alone. It's really a public-private partnership, but it's at the large scale. And it's a question of really bringing forward the handful of big actors that are the primary drivers of us still being on an incremental journey when it comes to solutions and on an exponential journey towards danger. So I think we're cheating ourselves. It's really false hopes to think that we can, just through consensus-based discussions here, get another piece of paper coming out of a COP30 with some commitments that nobody delivers upon. But we need to really find the tools that can eat themselves deep into the heart of the economy. And I think that what you've been exposed to here is one such example of how we can unleash a trajectory that makes sense to the economy in this orderly transition of the global economy. So I really hope that we can have a follow-up on this discussion. It really is needed.
Thank you.
Yeah, very quickly. I think what it makes clear is that even the COP and even the major negotiation part needs to integrate the private sector, especially not many of us talked about the financial sector. It's all about the real economy. So as long as the real economy doesn't play a major role in the negotiation, I mean, then we will not see the progress Johan just urged for. So I think point first is really have the real economy, financial sector, the private sector here at the COP, let them be part of the negotiation, because I mean, finally, we expect them to implement what is needed. If they are out of the discussion, well, it's not useless, but it's very difficult to get anywhere. And well, and the second point, let's stay optimistic.
So I think we're talking all about the power sector now, but actually I think the same approach and a data science-driven approach could work across a much broader part of the economy. I would also encourage them, the team, to think more about the sort of nature integration and particularly the health integration, because health is going to be what drives these issues in many emerging and developing economies. That's how it started in China. When I talk to policymakers in the countries where we operate, that's what's really on their mind. Use this initiative to bring health to the forefront as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Eric, you've been talking about other sectors. So I'm pleased to say that we also have a lot of data on other hard-to-abate sectors. So they are part of the agenda within IDP. Also modeling on air pollution that Alyssa and her team has led on. So we're trying to obviously integrate as much of the nature health aspects as possible. There's not much for me left to say other than thanking our distinguished panel so much for being here, everybody for being in the room and online. And I'm sorry we didn't have any questions in the panel, but I'm sure we can take this offline now and have some bilateral conversations. So join me in thanking the panel. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much.